Ladies and gentlemen, today with us is the doyen of the grey listing that is going to happen to South Africa. Byron and I made a video about grey listing a while ago, and Byron was basically right for 2 months, well, roughly 2 months before anyone else. So, before we start, Byron, firstly, it's great to be in the presence of such a prophet, and secondly, just explain to us what is grey listing, not the effects, just what is it in reality.
Yeah, so we did this video 2 months or so ago, and nobody watched it because it just seemed really boring. In fact, I recall you even didn't really want to kind of make the video because it was that boring.
And
But
it was boring.
the
The topic is
consequences
boring.
of it are not boring.
Not
The
true.
consequences of it are not boring at all.
And that's what we're going to discuss
So
today.
what it effectively means is that every country, when it trades with another country, has to go through the banking system. And if you want to see how difficult that can get, just have a look at like Russia's situation with this with their transfers. Like you can make it very difficult for people to transfer money between countries. Now that doesn't always necessarily mean England borrowing to Botswana. It's sometimes a English man who has capital who wants to send money to his business entity because he's buying some grapefruits from Botswana. That has to go from an English bank in terms of a transaction through to a Botswana based bank. Now, what happens around the world, especially post 9/11, is that obviously, as you know, a lot of terrorist groups were funded by foreign entities. I mean, there's an elephant in the room, and that is that a lot of those entities were funded by the Saudis, but we can't pick on the Saudis because they're too rich and powerful to pick on. So, in typical fashion, everybody put in place a bunch of money laundering type rules, which basically said if you were sending money internationally because you didn't know where the money was getting sent from and to, you basically needed to prior screen it for the purposes of terrorist funding or criminal enterprises or money laundering, possibly even just kind of siphoning cash. So if you go onto a grey list, it basically means that your country or your banking systems are not implementing those rules very well. And as a result, there's a high possibility that you are basically living in a state that may fund either forms of money laundering or terrorism, which basically means then that to the international community, if they continue to trade with you, in other words, they allow the exchange of money between the two entities, they could be complicit in terrorist funding. So they look at your controls and what you have in place to see if you're adequately controlling your own system so that they can say, for purposes of risk, their risk on their side is mitigated. It's lowered because you're doing your stuff, they're doing their stuff. The chances are of both of you falling over, it's kind of slim. And so they'll allow that. But where blacklisting occurs, or grey listing, if for want of a better wording, is where you aren't doing that job. So now I need to do that job for you, which basically means if I get money from your country or if I send money to your country, I have to assume it's going to be used for the purposes of basically financial fraud. It could be for the purpose of terrorist funding or it's money laundering. And so basically the kind of entities or the countries that are on that grey listing are usually kind of like, let's call them mafioso type states. They're not your typical like red brick type countries. They're usually states where, criminal enterprises are so kind of immune from prosecution that they almost don't give a flying whatever in terms of transferring illegal funds. So the reality is that South Africa is now going to go onto that list because they're assuming that the majority of the funds coming in and out of South Africa are fraudulent or corrupt.
Black market fund.
Now, members of the audience are going to go, well, that's obvious. But it's kind of not in a way because the reason we're going onto that list isn't because of the fraud. The reason we're going onto that list is because of the lack of prosecution, in
Indeed.
that our MPA has zero appetite to prosecute anybody who they identify as being corrupt. And that's actually fundamentally what the issue is. The issue isn't that we're allowing these things to kind of go undetected, like that we're almost so useless in detecting them. We actually do detect them. we just don't do anything about it. So it's like we know that
Yeah.
there's corruption going on, and we leave it.
So for example, the banks or the Banking Association of South Africa sent out a press release on the 11th of August of this year about what the impact of the grey listing would mean for South Africa. And it's quite an interesting press statement. So I'll bring it up here. And basically, what they say in 2021, the banks in South Africa reported over close to 400,000 suspicious transactions and over
Mm,
4.8 million cash transactions to the Financial Intelligence Center. Now,
hmm
banks are notoriously squeaky clean in terms of regulations. I mean, they impose most of them, but also if they don't follow the regulations or they don't report suspicious activity, they get fined very, very heavily, even for minor
Yeah,
things for the most part. But through this entire press statement from the Banking Association of South Africa is that we are banks. Our duty is to report things that are fraudulent or suspicious. It is not our duty to prosecute them. And that is where the failure is coming in. So the grey listing really is
correct.
about the the failure of the South African government, the ANC, to actually do anything with things that are reported to them as suspicious transactions. And we know why this is the case. A, they're incompetent, but B, most of the suspicious transactions are basically done by people close to them or themselves. And if we don't prosecute them, you have this sort of Mexican standoff where the prosecutor is put in place by the president, who's a member of the ANC. A lot of the suspicious stuff is created by the ANC. So now the NPA must prosecute the ANC. It's not going to happen, is it? But by it not happening, we are on the grey list, which is going to royally screw South Africa over dramatically. So what are the
Yeah.
effects of the grey list for the ordinary person in the street? What do they need to know about it if it does become a reality?
Oh, it's going to become a reality. And I think that even Treasury is now kind of getting to a point where it's accepting this is probably going to happen. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. To be honest, the first is that the government, through cater deployments and the variety of other dodgy dealings that they have going on, especially in terms of tender funding and tenderpreneurship, the government has a top control over the MPA. And the reality is that if you're a prosecutor for the MPA, you probably refer to a senior somewhere that has a link to an ANC cadre somewhere. And so for you personally, in terms of your career progression, it's not very good for you to prosecute these people because the reality is you're probably not going to go any further with your career. In fact, if anything, you might even be forced out of your job. And that prosecution might even just be frustrated. I mean, we all know, as an example, about Jacob Zuma's Stalingrad strategy. When in doubt, just feign things on forever and ever. And in that time, like your career in the MPA just gets made very difficult. Worst case scenario, you'll end up in News 24 being called a racist. Like, so it's not good for your career to kind of pursue a prosecution against an ANC individual. Now, the knock on consequences of that are that whilst these things are being known, there is a lot of it that's going on. Now, couple that with ANC ideology, and that ideology is linked very much to the South African Communist Party's ideology, and that is that the state should be the number one purveyor of services in the country, which basically means that the state should be the number one purchaser or consumer of services in the country. They're the one that basically controls all the private business and the way that everything kind of goes on. If you want to do anything with the state, it goes, or if you want to do anything in terms of state, let's say infrastructure like roads or whatever, goes through the state. Everything is run by the state, which basically means that your chances of getting involved in corrupt activity with the state is kind of high. Like
Yeah,
the reality is that most of big business has a link or a roadway into the state somewhere. And so the reality is the chances of there being some kind of financial transaction that's really not very clean is just overwhelming. So that now forces international banks with a problem because we've seen a good example is in the Zuma family. I mean, Jacob Zuma says he can't afford to, he wasn't a rich man. The man came from exile. but his son manages to live out of Dubai, one of the most expensive places in the world. Where'd all the money come from? Because it certainly isn't from his private enterprises and all the money he made on the stock exchange. So that money had to get transferred from a South African bank to a foreign bank sometime, and nobody picked it up as potentially fraudulent.
Sorry, Byron, we'll cut out there. So the actual implications for the man on the street through this grey listing is what exactly?
Yeah, so like I was saying, if you got instances where Jacob Zuma is sending money abroad, now we don't know if it's fraudulent or not, but international rules have to be based on basically a broad-based type spectrum. It has to assume that there's one rule that it will apply for all. So if you accept that this is occurring, then you have to accept that it may occur with everyone. You can't blanket say, okay, I'm only going to grey list ANC members. So what's the upshot to this for the average person in the street? The upshot is simply this, and that is they have to treat the individual farmer in, say, the Western Cape who exports grapefruit through to a foreign who was potentially sending large sums of money abroad for the purposes of financial money laundering. So basically, what it's going to mean is that your average farmer now, when he gets paid for services or he's paying for services possibly abroad because he ships his produce abroad, that process is going to become ridiculously difficult. And it's going to become ridiculously expensive for the banks to facilitate, which basically means that there might not be really much of an advantage to trade internationally.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, for anyone who does businesses over the border, right? Legitimate businesses. I got people I know who import various things from the USA, for example, to sell here as sort of mechanical parts for machinery. Now, the USA is going to be like, okay, the order for mechanical parts from South Africa, now they're on the grey list. Now we need like maybe some sort of vetting process from the FBI or something. I mean, I don't know how it works, but there will be
Mm,
increased bureaucracy to all of those transactions. And
100%.
that is more time, that is more money, that is product that doesn't ship in time, etc., etc. All the knock-on effects for that particular company is massive. Expand that to farmers, to anyone in this country who has businesses that do overseas transactions. It's like having FICA on steroids every single time you place an order. It's going to be an absolute nightmare.
It's going to be difficult, and primarily if you think about it, like the farmer in the east and say the Western Cape is probably the most important one to understand, and that's because produce has a shelf life. So if
Yeah,
you've got produce sitting in a shipping yard and you're not really willing to ship it yet because you don't know whether your funds have cleared, but it's taking you like a week to clear funds because of all the red tape, where everybody's kind of treating you as if you're some kind of terrorist funder. Like the reality is that the burden placed on you just to be able to trade abroad might mean that there's really not much benefit in trading abroad. Now, what does that mean for foreign countries? And I think that's something that you'll be able to get probably a lot more easier. There's not a shortage of emerging markets. And yes, okay, like in
yeah,
the pharma industry, we must say, yeah, but South Africa is a really big importer of, say, citrus. Yeah, but we're not the only ones. Like there's Brazil, there's India, there's a lot of other third world or other developing countries around. If it's easier to trade with those countries, South Africa will no longer be viewed as an investment hub. We will no longer be viewed as a place where you want to send your money. It
yeah.
will be much better for you just to trade with, say, India.
Yeah, just anecdotally, I met quite a few people. So I'm back home finally, but I met quite a few South Africans living in France and Portugal. And one of their biggest problems when moving over in the past 5 years was actually opening a personal bank account. Because as soon as you
Yeah.
say I'm a South African, the banks say, oh no, fraud, terrorism financing, etc., etc. We're gonna need like the golden seals of SARS to come through us, not even electronically, like physical copies of everything, because you're a South African citizen. Because the reputation of South Africa, especially in Europe, is so tainted by money laundering and terrorism financing that ordinary people who immigrated, who left South Africa, are struggling to open up bank accounts for years
Mm.
unless they get a few things that they need. So we can see the knock on effect already, but also once this happens and you are doing work through overseas transfers of funds, it's going to be a lot
It's
worse.
going to be difficult.
And the knock on effects for
Mm.
the country are so obvious we don't actually need to go through them. But once again, this is an ANC problem that is subsidized across the whole of South Africa amongst its most productive members of South Africa. That is the intense irony around this entire thing.
Yeah, I mean the thing is that whilst you've said and I've said, and the international community will say terrorist funding and all the other kind of malarkey that goes with it, let's not kid ourselves. South Africa's not okay. South Africa does fund. They do say South Africa does fund terrorism, but we're not like the number one terrorist funder around. Like you
No,
don't go. South Africa is not equivalent to say I don't know Pakistan or
Iran.
Afghanistan in terms of terrorist funding. Like we're not equivalent. So when we use these kind of terms, don't for one second think that we actually mean there's genuine terrorist funding occurring.
It's just much
What this
easier
is,
to do it here.
yeah, but it's still not really occurring. The real thing that's going on here is the mere fact that there is a possibility of money laundering, which, as I've rightly said about like the Jacob Zuma scenario, where has the son got the money from? And still no one can really answer that. So you have to kind of raise that as like with a bit of an eyebrow. Now, in the international community, when you come through and you ask those questions, and everybody goes, "Ah, it's fine. Don't worry, we would prosecute them if something's wrong." That's what they would say, and then you go, "But no, you don't. You don't prosecute. In fact, if anything, the case files and nothing happens." And that so the problem is an ANC problem. It's a state problem. It's an ANC problem. It's an ANC cadre problem, and it's going to have a consequence, a knock-on consequence for private industry in South Africa.
Yeah, this is like sort of the economic load shedding of our time. Like we're not going to have the capabilities
Yeah, I
to
think so.
fuel and fund our businesses that do cross border transfers. So yeah, once again, ANC problem masquerading as a national one, and there are no quick fixes. So Parliament has pushed through like various laws now, which include more regulations and all that. But even the Treasury and the DG of the Treasury said the laws are great, but we know that the fundamental weakness is the application of the laws and the effective prosecution under those laws. So
Mm.
even he says, I mean, it will be a miracle if we don't get grey listed come February next year. So, and if Treasury says we'll get grey listed, we probably will be grey listed. So, yeah, pucker up your behinds because this
Mm.
is going to be rough.
Yeah, I mean, they're saying though that the economic consequence of this isn't as severe as a downgrade in terms of sovereign rating, but they're saying that it's already been priced in. But I think that they're kind of like downplaying it. I don't think it's going to have any initial consequences on us as people as such.
Mm,
I just can't see that there's going to be as an emerging market that people are going to be like, oh, let's go invest in South Africa. And South Africa needs serious amounts of capital investment in order to allow there to be, 6-7% economic growth, which we need in order to solve the problems that we have. But I can't see that anybody's going to want to kind of spend their cash on us because it's just like, well, you're going to send the money there, and the reality is it's only going to arrive like in manana. And when
yeah.
you got things that are product sensitive, like citrus fruits or something like that, it's not a good scenario, man.
No, it's not. I mean, if you do online shopping, right, and you want a pair of shoes for 1,000 rand, right? One shop says pay us 1,000 rand, we'll ship it in 3 days. The other shop says pay us 1,000 rand, send us a copy of your ID, send us a copy of your bank statements, and send us a tax certificate,
Mm.
and then we'll ship your shoes. You're gonna be like, mate, I just want my bloody shoes. I'll pay you 1,000 rand. I'm not gonna go through all this other added bureaucracy
Mm.
from the other shopping site, but that's gonna be forced upon us
And that's what it comes down to.
as
Yeah.
South African businesses.
Mm.
What a nightmare. Anyway, so if you're in the business of, well, international businesses of transferring funds and all that overseas, let us know in the comments below. What are your thoughts on this and how can you mitigate it for your own business? It'd be very interesting to see what measures businesses will take to mitigate this risk, but I don't see much
Yeah,
happening.
I want to actually highlight something that could occur, but the minute I tell you as a mitigating factor, we'll have a laugh about it because it's so like it's just never going to happen. One way to do it would be to ask people to pay you up front.
True.
So I send you an invoice, you pay that invoice in 10 days from now, and then I do the product and I send it to you. Who the freak is going to trust South Africa to fulfill its orders? Like you're never going to get anything. So those are the type of mitigating things you could put in place. But then there's a degree of kind of like lack of trust in the business environment. The reality is you'll pay for stuff and never get it. So why would you do that? Like, so there are things you could do to mitigate, but none of them are useful given the backdrop of the other problems that we have in the country.
Yeah.
You know, the strikes, the meaning that the product or whatever that you might have might not even arrive at the port. The fact that your truck might get hijacked. But remember, you paid for these things up front. Somebody might just take that money and you never get your stuff. It happens all the time. So yeah, it's not good, man.
No,
It's not good. There's no short term solution.
no, nothing at all. Nothing at all, except for the demise of the ANC, which is going to take a lot longer than February next year, I'm afraid. Anyway, let us know in the comments what do you think about this grey listing. If you can mitigate it as a business owner, and more importantly, how it will impact you. Interested to find out in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you in the next one.
Yeah. Right.